the current Vice President of the Public Philosophy Network. I'm happy to be your event moderator tonight, and it's really excited to see such a great turnout for our conversation. So over the past several decades, pre-college and public philosophy initiatives have grown tremendously, led by undergraduate and graduate students, K-12 teachers and university faculty, community members, and more. These initiatives are creative and diverse in their aims. Tonight, we're focusing on an important and innovative subset of these initiatives, and we'll learn about impactful philosophy outreach programs guided by aims of social justice. Respectively, our panelists tonight have founded and/or lead public philosophy initiatives that serve incarcerated students in California, New York, and Alaska prisons, court-involved youth and victims of domestic abuse, as well as in-school programs serving high school students from groups that have historically been excluded from philosophy. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to thank both PLATO and the Public Philosophy Network for their leadership and collaboration in making this important event possible tonight. And also beyond that, just their support of public philosophy and pre-college philosophy more generally, which has been really crucial for the growth of this movement and this work. Just a few notes on procedure for this evening's event as well. I will moderate a conversation with our panelists for 40 minutes about that. And following that, we'll have plenty of time for your questions. For your questions, we will open up the chat a little bit later in the event so that you can submit your questions there. Or if you prefer, you can raise your digital hand and we will call on you to unmute and you can ask your question vocally. And with that, and actually one thing, for best viewing, we just recommend that you turn your view settings to gallery so you can see all of us at once and get more of the conversational feel. And with that, I'll introduce our panelists tonight. So Adam Blasey is an adjunct philosophy professor who's also working on a dissertation on hope and education. He is a coordinator of Rethink, based out of Columbia University in New York City. Rethink is a collective of New York City teachers and students promoting philosophical engagement outside a traditional academic context, mainly through co-facilitation of small participant-centered discussions in coordination with community organizations. Sol Neely is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and an associate professor of English and American Indian Studies at Heritage University, located on the Yakima Nation Reservation. Before relocating to Central Washington in 2020, he taught at the University of Alaska, where he founded the Flying University, a prison education program that brings university students inside the prison for mutual and collaborative study. Kyle Robertson is a lecturer in the UC Santa Cruz Philosophy Department and co-founder of the Center for Public Philosophy at UC Santa Cruz. He teaches at Mount Tamalpais College and San Quentin State Prison, where he organizes an annual ethics. And Brianna Toole is an assistant professor of philosophy at Claremont McKenna College. She is the founder and executive director of the philosophy outreach program, Corrupt the Youth, a program that brings philosophy to high school students from backgrounds that have been traditionally excluded from the discipline of philosophy. Thank you again to our panelists for donating their time to be here with us tonight and to share their insights and experiences. And I kind of want to just jump right into the conversation. So I'd like to invite our panelists to think about the fact that there's many types of philosophy outreach programs across the US at this time now. And each of you are engaged in a unique program with unique aims of their own. I wanted you to tell us a bit about what your program is and what it aims to achieve. And maybe if you could couch that in the sense of like core values or principles that maybe animate your work, that influence the development of your project, what makes it unique. And if we could start with Brianna.
Somehow had a feeling that you were going to start with me. So once again, I founded and run Corrupt the Youth. It's a philosophy outreach program that brings philosophy to high school students in Title I schools. And I would say the core values that guide the program are the idea that students are themselves sources of a huge amount of knowledge. And I think they have a deep desire to understand their world and to transform it for the better. But I think very often what we see in schools is that we don't talk to children as if they're adults with ideas of their own and opinions that they need to articulate and work through. And so with Corrupt the Youth, what we're trying to do is bring philosophy PhDs, philosophy grad students and undergrads into these high school classrooms to provide students with some frameworks and concepts that will help them understand some of the things that they're experiencing in their own lives, that they're witnessing in their schools and their community, so that they have the power to talk about that with other people and to name their experiences. I think there's a tremendous power in that. And so we're really guided by this idea that students know a lot and we should take them seriously. We should amplify and listen to what they have to say, and we should engage them as serious interlocutors.
Thanks, Brianna. Kyle, do you want to go next?
Sure. I love everything Brianna just said. That's like one of the big motivations for me in my program at Mount Tamalpais College is taking the incarcerated students as serious knowers and philosophers to engage with. The central value I was thinking of talking about right now is dialogue. Philosophers like to talk about dialogue all the time, and I just personally tend to enjoy philosophy most in conversation. And I respect all sorts of types of philosophy. And so the goals of my program are dialogue, right? The goal of Ethics Bowl in general is to teach us how to argue in a different way than the sort of adversarial, forensic style argument that dominates debate clubs and dominates our public culture. So there's a sort of, the program itself is designed around constructive dialogue. But then also in San Quentin, we have the Ethics Bowl team that competes against college Ethics Bowl teams from Northern California. So it's bringing in young students to dialogue directly with the team from San Quentin. And then we try to culminate in a round that invites people in to spectate and has judges that might be local politicians or people, whoever we can convince to come inside. And we ended up many years with hundreds of spectators of other incarcerated students. So trying to create dialogue among people who don't usually get to engage with each other about ethical, moral, and political issues.
Thank you, Kyle. Sol?
Hey, yeah, these are really great responses already. And some of the responses I'll offer dovetail with those really nicely. I started the Flying University. I was initially inspired by the Inside Out program, which I first learned about through Steve Shankman, University of Oregon, at one of our Levanos conferences. But there's a big difference between Flying University and the Inside Out program, and that is we violate one of the inviolable rules of Inside Out, which is that once the seminar is over for Inside Out, the inside students and the outside students are not allowed to communicate at all. But Juneau, Alaska is a small community of 30,000 people, and the people incarcerated are our neighbors and our family members. And so what happened is after the first semester of bringing university students inside the prison, some of our formerly incarcerated participants were released and they wanted to re-enter through education instead of employment. So they came to campus and they already had a community there. And so I think that one of the things about Flying University is it started as a prison education program. It became a reentry effort as well. I ended up serving years for the Juneau Reentry Coalition as their education coordinator. The guiding principles are about community organization, and it's rooted in a lot of what Brianna was saying. I think that one of the fundamental principles is that incarcerated peoples bear gift-giving capacity. That is, whatever trauma they've suffered or inflicted, most of the inmates I've encountered have perspectives, questions, experiences that we really ought to pay attention to in order to heal our communities. And that's an idea I get from a reading of Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Nelson Maldonado Torres writes about this, that the French title Les Damnés de la Terre, that word damné is etymologically associated with donner. So the idea is that, in the colonial context, indigenous populations don't have gift-giving capacity. And I see that as a very similar situation with incarcerated peoples. They're not received as having that kind of gift-giving capacity. And so by bringing the community into the prison, we do that to listen and to bear witness to these lives and learn about our communities from them.
Thank you, Sol. And Adam.
Hi, thanks. So I coordinate a group called Rethink. I'm one of the coordinators, and this is just a collective of educators in New York City. And we more or less run like discussions, small group discussions with people who are directly impacted by mass incarceration, and victims of domestic abuse and other forms of gendered violence. I suppose one core value, and this is maybe just repeating or building off what others, the good things others have said, is dialogical inquiry. And so as part of that, we try to seriously challenge the roles of the teacher student, and a goal is to, how to put it, like it's to challenge the idea that we are there, whether it be at the community organization or the shelter or the jail or prison, challenge the idea that we're there to be teachers and that the participants are there to be students. Challenge the idea that these roles are discrete and fixed. And so a couple of practical things, like concrete things we do to do that is, like, we have a co-facilitator model. So just as a rule, no one of us ever goes to facilitate a discussion on our own. We're always co-facilitating discussions. And in our communication with one another, with our partners, with participants, we always refer to ourselves as facilitators, not teachers. Similar, I think, to what Sol was describing, we try to keep things alive in some sense. After, usually our discussions end after some number of months, but we try to keep it going. And one way we do that is we invite past participants to come on board, so to speak, as facilitators, co-facilitators with us. So that's something we've been able to grow with the help of our community partners and the rest of the community.
Thank you, Adam. And I noticed in these responses, just obviously the focus on dialogue. Also, several themes around the idea of kind of tapping into the knowledge and the lived expertise and the gift-giving capacities of the populations that you're working with in these programs. And I guess I wanted to think with you about, does philosophy provide something distinctive? Using philosophy or philosophical methodology, does it do something distinctive to bring value to these populations that you're working with in terms of accessing these insights and this lived expertise and these gifts that you're referencing? Why have you chosen a philosophical methodology, and what value specifically do you think that's bringing to your work with these populations? And maybe start with Sol.
Yeah, sure. So, one of the philosophers to whom I'm most indebted is Emmanuel Levanos. And so, he describes his own project as one of translation. So in his case, translating Judaism into Greek. And so what I love about Levanos's work is he really starts the shifting points. He shifts the starting points. He shifts the starting points for so much philosophical inquiry. So there are aspects of that I really pick up on, particularly when we're thinking about phenomenology. I think his phenomenological starting points are so rich. He moves us from a consciousness of seeing to a consciousness of hearing. His phenomenology is grounded in that oral tradition of his Jewish roots, which really intersects well with my decolonial concern, right? The oral indigenous traditions. And then on the other hand, too, I wrote about this in the pre-college public philosophy article. I love Jean-Luc Marion in his, in his work, The Erotic Phenomenon, when he says, if philosophy is the love of wisdom, it seems to have kind of forgotten that task of loving. It seems quite content with wisdom and giving up on the difficulty of loving. So when I think about, the public philosophical enterprise, a lot of times it's very critical of, as I think all of us are, right? All of us who are doing public philosophy, we become very critical of academic and professional philosophy because at some point it seems to have lost that capacity for loving. It seems to have lost that capacity for listening in that rich kind of way that I think is actually restored by Levanos's consciousness termed hearing. So yeah, I think that, philosophically, we began by problematizing, sort of Euro-Western historical philosophy. So.
Thank you, Sol. Yeah, and Brianna, what about you? Is there, in terms of your use of philosophy, you work in Title I schools a lot, and you mentioned it to start us off. I mean, the importance of kind of accessing the abilities and great capacities that these students have that you're working with that sometimes are overlooked or overseen, if not often overlooked and overseen. So what is philosophy offering that's allowing you to, you think, engage with this population successfully in a way that's been positive in your work?
Yes, I think I have to say a lot of what Saul said resonates with me and the motivations for Corrupt the Youth as well. I think partially I was motivated to bring philosophy to this population because it was impactful for me. You know, I wanted to go to law school. I took an ethics class because, you know, I wanted to do well on the LSAT. And it was the first time that instead of thinking about, you know, do we punish this person because they violated this law, it shifted the thinking to, well, is the law just? And then this really important question for me as an epistemologist, who made the laws and what informed their conception of justice? And then you realize, oh, wait, people who look like me and share my background were left out of those discussions. And it was this deep desire to bring those questions to people like myself who have a right to contribute to that discussion. And so I think of philosophy's project, you know, Saul mentioned the love of wisdom. I think also a key component of philosophy is we want to learn how to live a good life. It just seems unjust to me that some people are fundamentally deprived of that opportunity and the opportunity to think about what it is to live a good life and what that means and why some people are deprived of that opportunity. And so, you know, obviously bringing these questions to high schoolers can be a little dangerous because then you're starting these rabble rousers, but I think that's what makes it fun. That is why we are called Corrupt the Youth, because I think we're continuing that Socratic tradition. We're continuing that project of trying to get the people to look at the systems that they participate in and to destroy the hell out of them if that's what it takes to create a better world for us as a collective.
Thank you, Brianna. Adam or Kyle, anything you want to add on that question too, in terms of how you think about the application of philosophical methodology and its impact in your work?
I mean, sure, I can go for a minute. I was really appreciating what you said, Brianna, but because I share it with my heart. One of the things I struggle with working inside a prison is that last like rabble rousing thing. I feel like I have to be careful of, because one of the things when you're working in an incarcerated environment is number one, don't want to have any of the students be at risk because they're in a domination relationship that I'm not a part of. And I also don't want them to write me a letter being, thanks for your work, don't come back anymore, you know, because I have no power, you know, like there's nobody else I can go to, so to speak, right? Now, so that was interesting that it really resonated with me. But in philosophy, I was thinking, I really like the just practical techniques of philosophy are very useful in Ethics Bowl. So there's like sort of two flip sides of that. On the one hand, you know, talking with these students who may never have sort of been to college before they're at Mount Tamalpais College, and to talk to them about how the thoughts they're having, the ethical intuitions they're having are actually like this rich history, and they're like lead to all these other arguments, and they're thinking exactly along these lines of these, you know, famous, well-known arguments. That can be really empowering for them. And then the flip side is I think it's incredibly useful for them to start thinking about why somebody would approach ethical and political issues from a different point of view. Like the philosophical literature is just really useful for giving them material for understanding why people would think differently about things that might seem obvious to them.
Adam?
Yeah, I'm honest. I honestly, like, I'm not sure if I can like identify anything that's like distinctively valuable about philosophical practices. I mean, more maybe sort of along the lines of what Sol was saying. There's like the shared recognition amongst our group that, you know, philosophy, the way it's traditionally taught, is just harmful and disappointing and frustrating and limited in all kinds of ways. So actually a lot of what we do is like when we're like co-facilitating with one another, is like we're trying to figure out what we need to do or what we can do to like not reproduce the things that were sort of like done to us, and so in a sense, like through our education or that we continue to do in like teaching in more traditional settings. We try to figure out how to like, you know, so to speak, like unlearn those habits and skills. But you know, there's something distinct about like there's something valuable about philosophy. You know, like along the lines of what I think what Brianna and Kyle were saying, that not a lot of times, and people in general, I think, just don't get asked like what they believe, let alone like why they believe it. And just to be asked that question, I think, and to given like space to, articulate one's thoughts, or just even like think about one's thoughts, it's empowering. And yeah, I remember this one a couple times. We've had participants like sometimes we do thought experiments. Not my favorite way of doing philosophy, but sometimes we'll do thought experiments. And we'll do a thought experiment. It'll be like a fun discussion, and we'll come back the next day, and one of the participants will have said like, it just like the thought experiment, I was just like thinking about it all the time. It just gave me something to think about. It kind of like was like a sort of anchor, is how they sort of described it. I'm not sure what to say about that or how that's connected with philosophy, if at all, but yeah, that just came to mind.
Well, it's helpful, I mean, because you're giving this kind of a concrete example, small one of the way that your program operates this one way. And I'm thinking, I, of course, somebody who's done public philosophy for a long time and very interested in all of your projects, and glad they exist and glad you're doing the work you do. But I'm wondering in terms of like the impact of your programs, like, there's lots of ways we can think about the impact of education and public philosophy and pre-college philosophy, lots of dimensions in which we can consider that question. But I'm wondering if you have a example or a story, from your program that helps keep you motivated, and that you say, well, this is showing me that kind of, I think we are making an impact. This is doing something positive, and how you conceptualize that in the work that you're doing. So would you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, sure. Once, right, almost immediately, like I said, the Flying University, which I just intended for it to be a prison education project, bringing the community inside the prison, bringing UAS students inside the prison, because it so quickly became a reentry effort as well. It immediately became endeared by the community. It just became really, the community wrapped its arms around it. Unfortunately, we had Governor Dunleavy, like I said, who campaigned on the tough on crime stuff, promised to cut all the prison education programs in the state of Alaska once he was elected, which he followed through on. But before that, Juneau is a little tiny blue dot in a big red state, and the community really wrapped its arms around us. And, so seeing the students who were formerly incarcerated come out, attend UAS, and get their degrees was just such an inspiring thing. They worked so hard together. They created a cohort. They created a student club at UAS called Flying University at UAS, campus support group. They had faculty, staff, admin, other students. They would hold potlucks, barbecues on campus. One of the formerly incarcerated students, who was Clinkett, he took my intro to philosophy class when he got out on campus. And I remember it was about halfway through the semester, and we're talking about some cool philosophical issue, and he said something so profound. And in the moment, right after he said this really profound thing, the class kind of went quiet. And about 2 seconds later, he just yelled, "Fuck, I'm a philosopher." And it was so exciting to see that realization, right? That he's like, yeah, I've got wisdom to bear. I've got a community who's gonna listen to this. And so I think that's what it is, really seeing those community relations repair themselves in the wake of this.
It's a great story. Thanks, Sol. Kyle, what about you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm actually going to tell a different story than I was planning to, based on what Adam, you said about thought experiments. But I wanted to say, like, a lot of why I do what I do is to work with this incredible organization called Mount Tamalpais College. And so, like, the higher education in prison in general serves tremendous goods that I'm not going to talk about, but they're actually a fully accredited community college inside San Quentin. It's an extremely unusual, amazing program. And like, so working with them is amazing. And part of why it's amazing is I tried to start multiple education programs with incarcerated students before that on my own, locally in Santa Cruz. And so one of those was in a maximum security facility in downtown Santa Cruz. I had a discussion group of guys on their cell block, and we would talk about kind of whatever would get them talking. But one day we talked about the trolley problem, right? Most infamous of thought experiments that we might talk about in ethics. I thought it went fine, but I came back the next week and I realized that in that cell block, one of the new lingo was accusing each other of being lever pullers. So they were like every day, like that whole week, they'd be like, oh, you did that, you'd pull the lever. Like they had been talking about it the whole week, and it became like part of it like really kind of like got its hooks into them, right? I just thought that was amazing. That was one of the early experiences I had that made me think, oh, okay, I really want to keep doing this kind of work.
Thanks, Kyle. Adam, how about you? How do you conceptualize impact in Rethink?
How do I conceptualize impact? It's hard to say, because usually that conceptualizing, I think, happens, with like the community partners. We think about what their aims are, how their program works, and we try to work alongside that. But yeah, just like a couple of I guess impactful moments. Yeah, one time we had done like this, where I said before, is like we invite past participants to join as co-facilitators, and we did this a few times. One of the times, the past participant became like a co-facilitator. She, I think it was her first time helping us facilitate a discussion, and she said, well, can I just take notes or something during the discussion? And I thought, yeah, if that's what you'd like to do, yeah, you can just take notes, but feel free, just chime in, or interject, or she was taking notes, and then we were getting towards the end of our discussion, and she went to me or one of the other co-facilitators and said, I just took all these notes and I created a spoken word piece. Can I share it with everyone? And I said, okay, yeah, let's wrap up the discussion by doing that. And so she just shared this sort of synthesis, a lot of the thoughts that were shared over the course of the discussion. She synthesized them in a particular way, and it's particularly powerful coming from her. And yeah, that's just something I appreciate that, because I mentioned before, we try not to reproduce the sorts of pedagogical practices that we think are limited or harmful. And yeah, that's just the sort of thing that just I think none of us would have just have done or have thought to have done. So I thought that was a success of sorts.
Yeah, fantastic. And Brianna, what about you?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd kind of like to take this question from a couple of different perspectives.
Sure,
because one of the things that is unique about Corrupt the Youth is that we're not just here for the students that we work with, but for the volunteers as well. One of the things I noticed when I was a grad student is that I would tell my peers, what it was like where I went to school, or what it was like where I taught when I taught high school. And I don't want to say there was suspicion or outright doubt, but there was definitely an element of disbelief. And it was the first time for me that I realized that so many of the people that I was in school with, and so many of the people who are in the academy, have educational backgrounds that are very different from my own, and so do lead them to think that things are mostly okay everywhere, and that they resemble the sort of schools and upbringing that they had. And so one of my favorite experiences that was really humbling for all of us, but especially for the volunteers leading the session, we did this aesthetics class in Austin, where our first chapter was started. And the volunteers had planned to do a gallery walk and show the kids a bunch of different pieces of art, and suss out their intuitions and determine what makes something art, and versus just a collection of nonsense. And one of the pieces they chose was the Piss Christ. And so for those of you who don't know what that is, it's literally just a crucifix in urine. And so I was very on edge about that, because a lot of our kids, do go to church, and I didn't want anyone to be offended, but they just blew my mind. One of the kids gets up to give his presentation of his analysis of this artwork, and he's like, what if the artist is trying to show that the redemptive power of Christ is so impressive that it can purify even urine? And it was just none of us, even the person who was there, who was actually an aesthetics professor, had really entertained that perspective before. And so it was really, really humbling to see what brilliant things these kids will say when they're just given the opportunity to talk and process their thoughts and be a little silly. And so it was nice for volunteers to walk away realizing it doesn't matter where kids come from. It doesn't matter what they're exposed to. They're bright and insightful. They just need to have the opportunity to explore these issues.
Right.
But other than that, we've had lots of kids come through our program in the last 5 years, many who have gone on to college. Not all of them are majoring in philosophy, that's fine. But we definitely have had a couple of students who, they were taught at high school by one of our volunteers, and then they went on to college and were taught by that volunteer in the college classroom. And so being able to continue working with these students, even when they leave our program, has been really lovely. We just had 2 of the students who participated in our summer camp. One has been named a Questbridge Fellow, and will be going to BU. The other just received this monstrously large scholarship to a small liberal arts college in Ohio. And we continue to work with them to like prep their personal statements and things like that. So it's just nice to see what kids can accomplish when they have adults who are in their corner, not guiding them, but providing, help or insight or support when they need it.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So I guess, I want to focus, with the stories and the anecdotes you're telling here, kind of illustrating some of the impact of your programs and the successes you've had. And all of you have been successful, right? Obviously, and putting forward a lot of work and effort and working with others to develop influential, philosophy outreach programs that are doing innovative work. But I imagine some people in our audience tonight are maybe interested in, volunteering in one of these programs or starting their own with some colleagues or on their own, however they're thinking about that. So I want to invite you as panelists to think back when you were first involved in creating and implementing your program, and maybe think about kind of challenges that you faced during that process, of which I'm sure there were large and small ones. But with that in mind, what practical advice would you have for audience members who are interested in developing social justice focused philosophy initiatives? I know that question would be context specific in many ways, but to the extent you can, what advice would you provide others that are interested in beginning this kind of work? And Kyle, can we start with you?
Yeah, please. I'm going to pass on something that somebody told me this week, the head of Mount Tamalpais College. I was talking about this with her. So this is somebody who started this program in the 90s, right? So created this program from nothing. Because I'm saying that because her advice was, look really hard to see if there's any organization or place that's already doing what you're doing and within which you can work before you start a new organization, right? And this comes from somebody who started this groundbreaking organization, right? She's like, you may not find it. You may be like, no, I really do have to do something new here, right? But if you do start the new organization, you run the risk of becoming an administrator and an HR manager, right? And doing less of the work you may have been inspired to do in the first place. And somebody has to do that. So that's important, right? Somebody's got to do that. But anyway, so I think that's really good advice. And it worked for my program, right? That I'm able to do so much volunteering for Mount Tam. I started 3 different local programs in jails, and they all went away. Some for political reasons, other for interest reasons. And they were great attempts, but yeah. And so the center is the same way, right? The Center for Public Philosophy here at UC Santa Cruz really started as kind of scaffolding for programs that already existed, that were already flourishing. And then we needed kind of a formal place for them, particularly the High School Ethics Bowl. But yeah, so, and the side effect of that too is that if you do look hard, and then even if you don't find an organization, you'll find people like the PPN and the organizations here, right? That sort of networking with other like-minded people has been hugely valuable to me.
Very good advice I've experienced firsthand. I had to learn the hard way in some cases too. So thanks, Kyle. Brianna, what about you?
Yeah, I really have to second everything that Kyle just said. Definitely look to see if there is already some version of the thing that you want to create out there, because especially for Corrupt the Youth, like it takes a lot to convince a school to let you come in and like take up a class period. And then it's, you've got to convince the volunteers to give up, hours of their time and then to participate in pedagogical training, because we really don't get that otherwise. And so if there's something already out there, it's just much easier to do a version or a branch or an extension of something that's already there. For the record, Corrupt the Youth will be holding interest meetings in April for people who are interested in starting new chapters. And so if you're interested in that, you should visit our website and email me at brianna@corruptthe.youth.org. Because yeah, Kyle's right. Like you just get so bogged down in admin and stuff. And like, that's where I'm transitioning to as well, like less interaction with kids and more behind the scenes, making sure that this spreads and that we have the opportunity to build as many chapters and corrupt as much youth as possible. Yeah, so that'd be my advice as well.
Thank you. And yeah, just to reiterate, I put Brianna's email. Brianna, correct me if that's not correct, but yeah, the email in the chat there. So please do feel to reach out and check out the Corrupt the Youth website for more information on those organizational meetings. Adam, is there anything you'd like to share in this too?
Yeah, I mean, so three quick things. One is, thinking intentionally about developing community partnerships, and as part of that, just creating lines of communication. For us, part of that is, when we go meet community partners, we research them, we see what they're all about, and we ask them for feedback, or if there's trainings that they put their staff or other volunteers through that we can also do, to try and, like, in some sense, embed ourselves into the culture of the organization. And yeah, to add, I just like second or third, I guess, what Kyle and Brianna had said. Yeah, see who other people who are already doing the work. Yeah, we try to think like broadly about what that is. Like just thinking about what we're doing in relationship to broader, I guess, like social movements. It's like in New York City, thinking about what we're doing alongside prison abolitionist work in the city. And I guess third, related to that, also thinking about like the institutions and groups that are sort of antagonistic towards some of our aims, I suppose. So our example, we're technically based out of Columbia University, and in case anyone here is not familiar, Columbia University, it's called a university, but it's perhaps better described as a hedge fund with a campus, and it's played a massive historical role in gentrifying and policing and surveilling the community of Harlem in particular, but not just Harlem. It's one of the largest landowners in Manhattan, in New York City, and it's just devastated communities in the city, contributed to the problems of incarceration, amongst other things. The things that we're there to sort of reflecting on and responding to. And here we are, we're part of this institution that has this, like, that continues to have these effects. So to say we try to sit with that'd be too like passive. We try to think like how we can challenge that. And yeah, it's yeah, usually the best way to do that is like going outside of the university and finding allies from outside. Yeah, so I think those are the things I would add.
Thank you. And Sol.
Yeah, I'm glad I get to go last on this one, because one, I agree with everything folks were just talking about here. All of those are really important concerns that we had to deal with as we founded the Flying University. But in terms of practical advice, beyond the establishing of the program, right away, it's about accountability, right? You've got to be accountable to the incarcerated, or in my context, accountable to the incarcerated people that we served in the prison. And this is something I learned actually by attending a class inside the Riverbend Maximum Security Prison in Nashville. And I think it was 2013, Lisa Gunter organized a conference at Vanderbilt on rethinking prisons. And I showed up early and was fortunate to be invited into the Riverbend Maximum Security Prison. And they had a program there called SALT. I can't remember what the acronym is, but that's something that the organizers repeated over and over and over again. You got to be accountable. And so when I started the Flying University, I just started the Flying University in 2012. I got to go into Riverbend in 2013. So when I got back to Juneau, the first thing I did was I went into the prison and I convened a committee of our inside students. And most of them were serving long sentences, but some were just in for a semester or two. And we would meet on occasion to see how the seminars were going, what we could do to improve, what topics and projects they wanted to cover in future seminars. And so I think that was really important, because when you create that structure of accountability that keeps you accountable, right? I mean, most of the guys inside the prison, they've got accountability forced on them all the time. But when you go in and you take that accountability on for yourself, I also think it guards against the savior complex, right? Because you're going in there and you're saying, how can I do better? In what way can we develop this so that it's serving you? So yeah, that would be my big advice.
Yeah, a lot of interesting insights here. I want to actually, I don't want to be too selfish about my questions because I have lots of them, but I'm gonna bracket myself here a little bit, and I want to start sharing the wealth here a little bit and have the audience be able to jump in with questions. And we'll get to some of these as we move forward. So there are two ways for audience members to ask questions. I'm going to ask Kate Golden, who, by the way, big thanks to Kate for being on the administrative side of this and helping all this work tonight. As a staff member with PLATO. You can go ahead and enable the chat so people can put questions directly in the chat. I'll get to as many of those as I can as possible. And then also, if you'd like to ask your question vocally, you can raise your digital hand, unmute to ask your question, and then mute after you've done that. And our panelists will respond. For questions that you're asking, if it's for a specific person, just please note that in your question. Or if it's general, then I'll just frame that as best as I see fit. All right, so feel free to proceed with questions. Actually, while we're waiting for those to flood in, I'm going to ask another question. Actually, I wanted to, think about, first of all, this term social justice that we're using for the event tonight. Social justice is an important term, marshaled for multiple purposes, but it's also a really broad term. It's one that's used in lots of different ways. Sometimes, hard to pin down unless we really kind of think about exactly how we're using it. So what kind of conception of social justice is specifically relevant for your work as philosophers doing outreach and doing engagement? And how do you think about that and how it operates in the work that you're doing? And Sol, maybe we start with you.
Oh, yeah, I really love this question. I think I would say, in terms of conceptualizing social justice, to be a little bit reductive, I would focus on two key things. One of them comes from Emmanuel Levanos's phenomenology of sociality, which intersects with a certain thinking of historical violence shared by Walter Benjamin and Maurice Blanchot. And that's that we are always taking up our restorative projects in the wake of disaster or catastrophe. So Levanos writes, "In the beginning was violence." And despite the biblical casting of this description, that's not a theological claim, it's a phenomenological one, right? And so whereas Plato, seeks justice in his Republic by building a city out of nothing, which never happens, there's no city out of nothing, we are always arriving too late on the scene in the wake of violence that we might not have committed, but we're nevertheless obligated to repair. So that's one. And the second one really comes through the decolonial frame. And particularly in Alaska, given that Alaska Native peoples are dramatically overrepresented in the prisons, right? They make up about 18% of the general state population, but 40% of the state's prison population. I think that that's so key, is that we have to think about social justice in terms of decolonial and decarceral justice. And I think that the two go hand in hand on that.
So thank you for that. And actually, I just want to ask one more thing, if you've given a couple audience questions that came in, both about Levanos. So is there a good starting point for engaging with Levanos that you suggest, like a text or a website that you would recommend for the audience? There's two questions that people are interested in learning more about it.
Yeah, and I know we have some Levanosians here who might have better answers to me. One of the typical responses is to start with a set of interviews published as Ethics and Infinity. But I'll also say that my favorite essay, the one I love to teach the most, is an essay called Diachrony and Representation. And that's where he really gets into what are the sources of inspiration that inspire us towards social justice in the wake of the disastrous, right? But yeah, sort of the standard answer is to go to Ethics and Infinity, a set of interviews.
Thank you. So Cliftina and Frank, just kind of put a couple of recommendations in the chat for you there. Just to keep going though, did others want to follow up on this notion of kind of social justice and how it's informing your program, how you think about that in your work and informing your work? Brianna?
I can say just a little bit. I was a bit stumped by this question, because while I do describe us as like a social justice philosophy program, if you're going to ask like my conception of social justice, but somewhat I'm motivated by this experience that I remember of school, or just like of being a young person, especially a young person of color growing up in the South. I just remember feeling angry a lot and frustrated and wounded because there were things happening to me that I did not understand and that I couldn't really explain to others, and that adults were seeing and somehow not seeing at the same time. And I do think we just have a bunch of little angry youths running around, people who are frustrated because they don't understand what's going on in the world right now. It's a particularly difficult time, I think, to be in high school. And I think that before you can go out into the world and do good, you need to be able to understand that anger, not necessarily get rid of it. I think anger can be a really useful tool for social justice, but you need to be able to understand where that anger comes from. As I told a student recently, you need to be able to like weirdly hold anger and empathy in your heart at the same time. And it's hard to develop that kind of empathy when you can't understand why other people are doing things or think a certain way. And so my conception of social justice is very much like self-centered. At first, this idea that like we need to be given opportunities to repair ourselves and to understand ourselves and our situation in the world before we can extrapolate beyond our situation to start to change things for other people.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Kyle?
Yeah, I like all the answers. I struggle with this question too, because like Brianna's like, what does social justice mean? But I'll say like I was thinking about something Sol said of guarding against the savior complex is something I've thought about a lot in terms of prison education. It's been like widely discussed in higher education in prison contexts. I think that part of how I conceptualize what I do in a social justice frame is serving students inside in a way that they want, right? So the debate program started because they wanted a debate program. Like there's a history of debate, and that, you know, Malcolm X writes about his experiences with debate when he's incarcerated, and helping them be able to speak in a way that more people will listen, if that makes sense. Like it's not about me, and while also thinking that people should listen to them more no matter how they put it, right? But like the guys wanting to be able to put their ideas in a way that people in power will listen, right? So we have former students who write op-eds and like do outreach now that they're outside of prison. Can I help them learn how to use their voice in such a way that the politicians will care, you know, like, or care more? I don't know. It's like like providing access to sort of language and training that is a background condition for a lot of political discussion in our country is another way I think about it. So it's something of an answer.
Thank you, Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
Adam?
Yeah, I guess like quickly, I don't know what social justice is, but I think, you know, it's something like, you know, the purpose of knowing, that sounds kind of grand, but yeah, the purpose of knowing is something like, you know, to transform the world for the better. And so to that extent, the social justice requires rebuilding or remaking the world, whatever that is. And that requires that we rethink the ideas that orient us or guide us, or perhaps like stop us from doing that, from rebuilding or remaking the world. In that process, both of rethinking the ideas and of rebuilding the world, social justice requires that those who have been oppressed become the transformers, that they become the agents of change. And yeah, I don't know, like, I didn't just some like ideas that kind of like guide me. I'm like I was thinking of this riff that Cornel West has. What Sol was saying kind of made me think of this, is that you know, if you want to talk about hope, you gotta struggle with despair. And that's just something that I often think of, like in these like contexts. Yeah.
Thank you. It's definitely helpful, I think, to concretize that term a bit and understand how it's functioning in your work a little bit better. So a lot of great questions, practical ones and broader ones. This one I'm going to direct maybe initially to Kyle. I know Sol and Adam and maybe Brianna too might have some things to weigh in on this as well. But This comes from Frank, who says, I'm teaching in a prison and struggling with lack of access to materials and arbitrary prison disruptions of classes. I'm definitely familiar with that if you work in prisons. Any ideas? So ideas about, I guess, either materials you've used, access to materials, or how you've dealt with the inevitable disruptions to your classes when you're working in prisons. Kyle, suggestions, thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I'd be happy to talk to Frank or anyone else like off this, because it so much depends on the facility and where you're working. But in terms of access to materials, yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I would end up bringing in as much as I could, and it would completely depend on the CO I got as to whether I could carry things inside, things like this, right? And then class disruptions, I don't have a solution to this that I've ever been able to manage, because when you're inside an incarcerated environment and a CO tells you to do something, you do it. You basically have to do it, that you will never come back, right? The only leverage we've had, and I'll tell you, so this is why context matters, right? So Mount Tamalpais College has some form of leverage. And I think it's because of their time at the institution, and because of the fact that the warden at San Quentin is a political appointee, and higher education projects in prison in California are popular among a lot of people and a lot of funders, right? So there's like a political leverage where they can be like, I'll be on the phone to Sacramento if you don't, you know. And so like, and I see it inside the environment. If I'm with her, the director, she will be much more like assertive with the guy, like, and they know her. I have not figured out a way in my own role. I've had much more luck being just as polite, and, you know, I'm a former lawyer, so I can put on my very, like, I know exactly how this works. I'm going to, you know, I belong, I'm comfortable here, and try not to trigger any of the prejudices against the guards that would get them to treat me or not let me come in more. So that's, I don't know if that's helpful, but the offer to talk offline is really genuine too. I'd be happy to chat about your situation.
Great, Kyle, if you're comfortable doing so, you can message Frank with your email address, or you can put it in the chat, however, whatever you see fit to do. Sol, Adam, are there any other elements of practical advice you'd add to that response?
You know, I it's so arbitrary, right? I mean, one day I brought in a stack of readings that I photocopied on campus, and I wasn't allowed to bring them in because they each had a staple. And the guys inside, when I got up and I said, I'm sorry, my reading for today was confiscated by the guards. They're like, look, there's staples all over this damn room, the magazines, you know, it was so ridiculous. But I think Kyle's right, man. You know, Michel du Sarteau in Domination of the Arts of Resistance, who's got that wonderful Ethiopian proverb at the beginning, right? When the great Lord passes, the wise peasant bows deeply and silently farts. And there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of that, you know, that you got to do to get stuff into the prison. So,
Adam, any additions?
I think there's a lot you can do without readings, without texts, readings. Like, so for example, yeah, I meant to share this before, but we do like different sorts of discussion activities besides just like talking to one another. But that's a lot of what we do. Like, so one thing we do is like, we'll say that's agree, disagree activities. So so we've done this in some of the local jails. We'll say, okay, that side of the room will be agree, and this side of the room will be disagree. We're going to read a bunch of like statements, just like cliches, and then you move to the side of the room indicating how strongly you agree or disagree with this. And we do it, and it's a lot of fun. And we stop with each cliche and say, like, why are you standing there and not there? And, you know, people move around as we go along. And you know, we didn't need a text for that. You know, we could just come up with the cliches, you know, off our heads. And actually, after we did this, we came back the next week, and one of the students, I kind of, Kyle, getting to what you're saying about the rabble rousing. We came back, and one of the students, she had said, look, we did that activity together. After you left, we were having this argument with one another about like what to watch or what or something. And they said, okay, let's do this agree disagree activity. So like sort of like help us work through this conflict. So I thought that was just like telling of like how there's power in just like yeah, doing things besides like readings, and like using your body and moving around, like using the space in other ways, you know, which like, you know, jails can, you know, restrict that as well. But yeah.
That's a great practical suggestion. Thanks for that, Adam. So next question comes from Tiffany Sansulas. And Tiffany, this is for anyone on the panel, so I'll let as many of you or as few of you respond as you see fit. How do you assess the impact of your programs? I know we talked before about stories and anecdotes, but maybe it's a broader assessment question. Are there any particular metrics that you look for in relation to that topic?
I'll start, but my response may or may not be helpful. On the one hand, when you have programs like this, and especially when you're trying to get rich people to give you money to expand them, you obviously want to be able to like pull out charts that say, you know, of the 300 students we've taught, 80% went on to do so and so. But we're honestly kind of resistant to collecting that sort of data or judging the efficacy of our program by it, since so many of the measurements that exist are kind of repressive and structured by dominant paradigms for what constitutes success. And so we're looking for something a little less quantitative and a little more qualitative. So like we're looking for things students say, changes in their comportment and how they interact in their other classes, for instance. So that does require gathering testimonies from their other teachers or from the classroom teacher that we partner with. But above all, what we're looking to see is, I was just on this podcast this morning about conflict. And what I was saying there is that conflict is not a bad thing, actually. I think conflict is great. It's just that we're really bad at conflict. And so people, especially young people, they can blow up when they're challenged. They can get angry. They can stomp their foot and walk away. And so we're trying to make sure they are better interlocutors. That's what our measurement for success is. Like when they're challenged, when they're confronted with something they disagree with, do they blow up, or can they say, wait a second, tell me why you think that? Can they apply some of the frameworks and concepts and skills to assessing the situation that they're in so that they can handle it more effectively, so that they can walk away from that confrontation feeling proud and not, as I often did as a kid, thinking, shit, I have a good comeback now, but that interaction was 20 minutes ago, which leaves you feeling frustrated and disempowered. And so I think when you're working with these sorts of programs, you really do have to be mindful about, and I think Adam touched on this, like, are you doing the work in such a way that you're reproducing the very systems that you're trying to challenge?
Mm-hmm. Kyle, Adam, or Sol, anything else specifically on the assessment topic that you wanted to contribute?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I just briefly, I mean, I've struggled with the same kinds of things Brianna was talking about, of looking at assessments for Ethics Bowl in general. We've done like a variety of assessments or tried for Ethics Bowl of how would you measure the impact this has on children. And the drive is exactly as Brianna says, funders want to see it. You know, you're writing the grant application, you want to have to say something about what impact your program is going to have. And it's been very difficult to find something satisfying. So we take a lot of qualitative data, and that's been good enough to get some of the smaller grants for the center. In the context of San Quentin, it's like, it's a university, so there's grades involved, there's student feedback and all that happening inside Mount Tamalpais College also.
Right. Yeah. Adam?
Yeah, one thing that we do at the end of our discussions that's kind of like just like incorporated into, at least the way, like when I co-facilitate with others, what we do it is we end every discussion by asking 3 questions. We ask, what were we doing? Why were we doing it? And what's next? And that's a form of, assessment. We just try to figure out what is it we were doing? Oftentimes it's not clear what it is we were doing. And, it's a good opportunity to invite students to tell us what they thought we were doing. But then also think about why, if at all, it was important. Maybe it wasn't important, and we can think about that. But then one way we think about like the what's next question, we might mean like, what's next? What are we going to talk about next time? But it also might mean like, how, if at all, will this, practically change what we do, outside of that space? Like what's next there? So asking those 3 questions, that's like a sort of assessment, but it's, and we can use that sometimes for like, I don't know, like getting like qualitative data, so to speak, I guess, but it's not really usually treated as such.
Thank you. So next question comes from Ian. And again, I think this is for any panelist who wants to take it. Thanks so much for an awesome panel. One question, for people doing public philosophy work with some sort of social justice bent, there's often a substantive political vision motivating the work. And that substantive vision might be unpopular with various gatekeepers. Maybe views about the limitations of schools for P4C work, or abolitionism motivating prison educators. Do you think that's right? And if it is, how do you handle that tension between the vision that's animating your work and gatekeepers? So
Yeah, that was the big obstacle that I experienced in Alaska, because you got to understand there's a pretty fierce anti-intellectualism in the state of Alaska. A number of our state legislators only have high school degrees, and so they really don't care much for college, university. They have these obsolete notions of justice as punishment, so they're against any kind of prison education program and stuff like that. And of course, with the election of Governor Dunleavy, that was a huge blow to us. So how do we combat it? Well, we constantly get the stories of our students out. We published a volume of Flying University poetry. I did a number of media presentations on the local NPR, public radio. We connected with our legislators because Juneau is the capital. I was always going and delivering testimony at the Capitol building. And then at one point we had some of these formerly incarcerated students who ended up getting out of prison and coming to the university. I organized a legislative advocacy training session for them. And so we spent the whole day at the Capitol, and they learned how to give testimony. They learned how to conduct themselves in the chambers. And so we just had to fight it constantly politically on the ground, through advocacy, storytelling, and just showing that the narrative of retributive justice is an obsolete narrative. It doesn't work, and those kinds of things. So it was an endless battle, but yeah.
thank you for sharing that. So anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
I would love to, yeah.
Sure.
I just because this is a question I've worried a lot about, and Ian, like, it's exactly right that prison abolitionism motivates me, and that the system doesn't like that. But the best answer I've heard is from one of my students inside San Quentin, and he gave a whole argument about how you have to relate to it like a hacker. So the way that a hacker works within a system and finds the weak points, but the best hacker never gets caught. Like, you don't know you're there, right? You're working in there and you're pushing on things and you're getting it to do what you want it to do. But if you've got to be good in it, other things you have to be good. Like, it's a dangerous metaphor too, because if you're really going to be hacking and you get caught, you get kicked out, right? And so, but that was the image he gave me that resonated with me a bit, of like, how do you try and grapple with working within a system while trying to undermine it in some ways also, or having a general political commitment to undermining it.
Brianna or Adam, anything you want to add?
I mean, yeah, when we go into schools, we're really clear with the principal and the teacher we end up partnering with that we're doing social justice through philosophy, and that I don't have a particular political direction that I want them to go. Rather, it's we're going to look at some readings or discuss some questions that are going to help them understand certain aspects of their experience and socialize better, right? But with schools especially, and working with teenagers, parents can be the really prickly folks, right? And so what we found is the most successful is getting the parents on board. And one of the ways to get parents on board is to like make it really clear that we're offering something of value. Like, we're bringing in these people from Columbia and NYU and MIT and Harvard, and it's like, yeah, don't you want your kid to have access to that and to the information and the benefits that provide? So that's helpful. But I also think letting them know that I am a person who came from a similar background works to alleviate some of their concerns. And so I think when you're doing public work, one of the things that makes me uncomfortable, but like that you just have to do, is you have to learn how to leverage yourself and your identity in service of this broader thing that you're doing. And so when I am putting myself in contact with parents and the students and the principal and the teacher, it's much more difficult to shut me down, because it's like, I'm a real person who actually, has experience teaching high school and like then went on to do these other things. And so you can disarm people, I think, through your passion and your commitment to what you're doing. So yeah, leveraging yourself a little bit.
Well said. So I want to also note here too, just, we have research articles from both Kyle and Sol, actually Sol's is forthcoming in volume 4 of Pre-College Philosophy and Public Practice, which is a research journal sponsored by the Kegley Institute, the Squire Family Foundation, and PLATO. And so if you're interested in these questions about assessments, if you're interested in questions about social justice, motivations, kind of the research that informs a lot of this work that's happening, they're really excellent research articles that are on cutting edge work happening in this field. So I encourage you to check out the journal, to share it with your friends and peers, and encourage other people to submit. And we're going to try and encourage Brianna and Adam to get some pieces in there too. So I don't see any other questions in the queue right now. And so I think we're getting close to closing out time anyway. So I want to ask a question, maybe to close us out here. And what's a source of, for those who are interested in this work, want to go into this work, maybe already practicing this work, I wonder if their panelists would be willing to share a source of inspiration that drives you forward and gives you the energy to do this work, often, in addition to, also other aspects of your career, which are in addition, above and beyond these programs that you're running. And sometimes there's that tension between being a professional philosopher or a grad student or undergrad student and doing outreach work. Unfortunately, that tension does exist sometimes. So are there particular philosophers or educators or films or literature, whatever it might be? I mean, what's the source of inspiration that you carry with you to drive this work forward for you, that keeps you inspired and moving forward with it? It'd be great, I think, if you could share that with the audience, so maybe they could take some inspiration from it as well. Brianna, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I'm going to try not to get like misty-eyed talking about this. I'm still really devastated by the death of Charles Mills. But it's not like he wrote about education in particular, right? But reading his work, and when I think about his experience, what it must have been like being like the lone Black person studying philosophy back then, that's what pushes me to continue doing this work. Because, part of the motivation selfishly for starting Corrupt the Youth was I was one of 2 Black grad students at UT. Like, I just can't stand being alone anymore. And then I think about people like Charles Mills, who did it knowing that they were going to pave the way for a generation of Black philosophers. I find that deeply motivating. But also Bell Hooks' teaching to transgress is so wonderful. My college students, I don't know why they would know about this literature, but they do, and they're always eager to talk about it. That gives us a really strong model of, liberatory learning, this idea that school shouldn't be a slog. Right now, it's killing our kids. I think it's breaking their spirit, but there's a way to re-inject joy, and Bell Hooks provides a lot of really good information for how to do that. But then in terms of our structure, the program that Saul mentioned earlier, Inside Out, the prison exchange program, has actually been a really, really useful model for us as we're continuing to expand and grow, since what they're doing is, partnering between certain institutions and prisons and then colleges. So those are the things that I suggest and look into. Yeah.
Thank you, Brianna. Great recommendations. And I will put the Inside Out link in the chat. Brianna, if there's any particular works by Charles Mills that you think would be particularly useful.
Literally everything, but in all seriousness,
yeah,
Blackness Visible, because he starts the book with a chapter on non-Cartesian sums, and he talks a lot about why Black students in particular feel alienated from philosophy. And that definitely has shaped how I want to approach philosophy when I teach it and do it with kids.
Thank you, Brianna. Kyle?
Sure. I had a list of 4. So Brianna took one already. Bell Hooks is amazing and a huge inspiration, and maybe my favorite UC Santa Cruz alumnus. But the paper that the one that I read every year is Christy Dotson, How Is This Paper Philosophy? I love that paper. I give it to undergrads too. Philosophy majors love it the senior year because they're like, yeah, like it often gets them to start to like wonder about this thing that they've been studying for years. So I'm just a huge fan of Christy Dotson. And then Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I think, is another thing that I keep coming back to in terms of thinking how to run a classroom and how to run a classroom in an carceral environment in particular. wait, I said 4. Oh yeah, so fully moral philosophy nerdy. I love Nomi R. Polly, and I'm always fascinated by her work. So she's somebody who really brought me to ethics, and her book Unprincipled Virtue.
Thank you, Kyle. Adam?
Oh, yeah, yeah, so Freire, Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, but also like fiction writers, or not necessarily fiction, but like James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, uh, and others in like critical traditions in philosophy. I don't know, like Dewey is on the minds of a lot of people involved in Rethink. So is Miranda Ficker's work on epistemic injustice. But yeah, I don't know. I'm also just inspired by a lot of people I work with and like who do similar work. I see my friend Veronica. I see Veronica, just constant inspiration to me. Karen Davis. You know, I learned about her work on like a letter writing program with students in prison. And yeah, Ian, you were here, Ian. Where are you, Ian? You still here?
He's
Right,
right.
there you are. Yeah, there you are, Ian. Yeah, yeah. And so yeah, all these people, as well as all the people on the panel. Yeah, and without that, it would just sort of what Brianna was saying, it would feel just like totally lost without that sort of community.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. And Sol.
So I'm going to answer this question totally differently, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
You use the vocabulary of inspiration in your question. And here again, Levanos will talk about how inspiration is linked to the literalness of respiration, right? Breathing in and breathing out. And we breathe into vitality, we breathe out into exhaustion. And that's just the honest cadence of our lives. So when I think about this question of inspiration, I want to think about it across generations. You know, my 3 times, 4 times, 5 times great grandmothers had their land stolen from them by settlers in what is today the state of Georgia, right, near Dahlonega, and forced into Indian territory. I grew up in Georgia. I was in high school and college at the height of the war on drugs there when the state troopers literally drove around in V12 Dodge Vipers with big anti-marijuana bumper stickers on the side. It was a police state, which is one of the reasons I ended up basically fleeing to Alaska. And so when we think about the settler colonial violence that's so centered there in what we call the state of Georgia today, and I think about the perseverance of my ancestors who were able to survive and pick up and build new lives for ourselves. And then it comes down to my grandfather, my Cherokee grandfather, who used to go down when he lived in Lodi, California, used to go down to the levees and feed the homeless people, take them to the hospital. He cared for the homeless people and he never told any of us. And when our family finally discovered he was doing this, we said, "Why are you doing this?" And his response was, "Because it could have been me." And I think about that all the time, how I could have been at any moment, I could have ended up in a prison in Georgia. You know, it really could have been me. And so when we think about the transgenerational trauma, and I think about my daughter who just walked in the door, she's 11 years old. You know, I really, that inspires me. That's my inspiration. It's the ancestral strength that I'm able to seize, and it's looking forward to secure a restorative community for my daughter and her, so she can develop her best competencies. So that's how I'll interpret that question.
Yeah, it's a wonderful interpretation. I think a great way to draw a close to our conversation tonight. And it's been super fascinating, really, and also moving to kind of hear about motivation, sources of inspiration, practical work you're doing. And, just so happy that we have great folks like you advancing public philosophy in our nation and changing the discipline for the better too. So thank you so much. Thanks most importantly to our audience. Thank you for coming and spending some time with us. And thank you to PLATO and to the Public Philosophy Network as well. And yeah, there's a comment here for, before we close out, for Brianna there.
Sorry, Michael, you called on me or?
No, it's just, there's a comment
Oh,
there.
yes,
for you.
okay.
Just make sure you saw that.